So, good afternoon, good morning, good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is the second World Value Survey webinar in the 2026 series. For those of you who did not join our events earlier, the aim of this webinar series is to let colleagues from different countries, from different disciplines present their analysis and findings based on the World Value Survey data. We welcome presentations that use WS data alone or in combination with the European Values Study or European Social Survey or other datasets. So if you are working on something new, exciting, or revisiting the already existing theories, and you would like to speak in one of our webinars, you are most welcome to contact our secretariat. The topic of our today's webinar is Beyond Grievance, Happiness as a Psychological Buffer for Radicalization. And very, very pleased today to have with us Ioannis Petrakis, who is a senior lecturer in economics at Newcastle Business School at Northumbria University. He joined Northumbria in 2024 as lecturer in economics and was appointed assistant professor, senior lecturer in 2025. Previously, Ioannis worked as a research fellow in economics at the University of Aberdeen and taught also economics at Glasgow International College at the University of Glasgow. Ioannis holds a PhD in economics from Glasgow Caledonian University, and his research interests include applied economics, household and personal finance, labor economics, and macro financial analysis. The presentation is largely based on the paper that has been published, and we shared the link with you earlier, but today Ioannis will be presenting the next version, upgraded version of the analysis, and we very much look forward to the presentation and also to your comments and questions. For the latter, you are welcome to use the chat function where you can post your questions or messages immediately as they come to your mind. We will also have some time at the end of the hour after the presentation where you can raise your hand and speak directly. So without further ado, Ioannis, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to present this work. It's a work, as you mentioned, which is under revision right now for a journal, so I'll present the latest version as of today. And the basis of my work is coming back almost 5 years ago when I was working for a Horizon project regarding de-radicalization, where this is when I started conceptualizing the framework, and I got the motivation to start this work in order to link grievance, as it's studied through recent studies, and subjective well-being, happiness. While the former version was talking about happiness, I'll explain shortly why I changed it to subjective well-being and why it's a better narrative in this case. And the basis of my work basically today is to try to link welfare on radicalization or an aspect of radicalization. I will explain much shortly because it's a context that's studied in recent works, and it emphasizes on works on grievance, on deprivation, whether there is a threat on identity or an exclusion feeling, as for example in the studies of Runciman in 1969 and later studies, as one of the latest is from Kruglanski and his co-authors in 2014. But one of the mechanisms that I noticed that it's not studied that much is how lived welfare and lived well-being structures and affects the disaffection from political status and potential alienation to the political sentiment in the country. So the idea is not to study in this work how people form a type of grievance against a status. It is to show the mechanisms and the psychological mechanisms behind this formation of grievance and how experienced welfare can help moderate or potentially even mediate in some cases those alienation trends over the world in this case. And one of the biggest conceptual changes that I made recently is that I follow, being myself one of them, the economist of welfare, where we separate the realized happiness and satisfaction with life, which is a recent topic that's studied and proposed recently. For example, in economic theory, welfare is studied through a utility function, which is basically an ordinal status, something like the standalone questions that every survey has. How satisfied are you with your life from a scale 1 to 10? But according to recent studies, as this one from Dinner and his co-authors in 2009, it's not only how satisfied you are with your life, it's how happy you feel. So in reality, welfare and well-being has two domains and two faces, how satisfied and how happy you are. And I will extend this part later on. So basically, the argument here is that the higher subjective well-being basically associates and correlates with a higher and works as a psychological buffer against distrust in institutions and potential anti-systemic attitudes over the world. And later on, and that's something that we should emphasize, is that it's not only who is deprived, but we are asking, and I am asking this work, it's how and who experiences life as going badly or unfairly or without hope, and how this psychological buffer and psychological mechanism create an alienation and anti-liberal attitudes over the political system. And obviously, the next phase of that is the realized radicalization, which is something that we can only observe through secondary mechanisms in this case. Now, the motivation basically comes from a decades-long studies. For example, there is relative work on relative deprivation and unmet expectations, as is, for example, the study of Runciman and Bagley back from 1969, or later studies from Gore in 2015, and Smith and his co-author, who suggest that relative deprivation is one of the main sources of alienation and one of the main sources of information of grievance and radicalizations in this case. And other studies, as the one from Turner, of Teifel, and Reicher and his co-authors, suggest that one of the reasons why people become radicalized is because they feel a threat against their identity. So they feel that their intergroup identity and intergroup comparisons are deprived and are getting worse time to time. And that's why, through this threat, they try to react and go beyond the acceptable actions, and they become radicalized. Other studies, for example, this of Brook, Lansky, Weber, and Zasko and his co-authors suggest that they feel a sort of humiliation, and they believe that there is a higher need for them for closure. That's why they are more receptive to rigid narratives and alienation announcements or speeches, and that's why this higher uncertainty and feelings of humiliation increase the radicalization trends in this case. The political disaffection literature suggests that the anti-systemic sentiment is basically linked to economic insecurity, which is one of the main sources of alienation. Obviously, there is also a cultural element in this case, because rigid narratives, those who are keener to rigid narratives are closer to feel threatened in their culture. There is also declining institutional confidence, as is, for example, suggested in works of Liberini and his co-authors, who suggest that confidence in institutions is one of the main mechanisms through which disaffection is formed over time. And later studies, as is, for example, those two works from 2017 for Liberini and his co-authors, and latest a work from Novakovsky in 2021, starts introducing life satisfaction as a strong association of anti-systemic alignment, and how lower life satisfaction can lead potentially to positive correlations with stronger anti-systemic alignments. Now, this work now is basically a conceptual extension and discipline. I could pose it mostly as this in recent literature, because recent work and existing work treats radicalization and alienation too broadly. It's not that focused in general. And my goal here is to offer subjective well-being as one of the mechanisms, and I call it as a buffer, but probably buffer conceptually it's potentially stronger than one can do with observational data, or as a proximate psychological channel is better to link it in this case, and also to add the role of distrust in institutions and the role of illiberal democratic conceptions when we analyze the, the narrative of why someone is radicalist, why someone feels closer to rigid narratives, for example, and why someone alienates against the existing political system in this case. And this is why I utilize the word biosurvey and in specific its latest publicly available way, because I am aware there is a wave 8 sampling right now for WVS. So it's ideal in terms of studies because it's rich in information regarding social trust. It has information about institutional distrust, democratic attitudes, social and anti-systemic trust, about economic conditions and how people perceive and how they feel within their countries about the economic status of themselves or their country. It has information about welfare domains, and in specific, it has questions regarding how satisfied they are. And they also measure, and this is very helpful for robustness even, the phases of life satisfaction, because this is equally important. It's not only who is satisfied with their lives lately, it's also which facet of their satisfaction is affected most in this case. So basically, the fieldwork was between 2017 and 2023. It's weighted at the nation, which is also very helpful. So it's rich in information, and it's very helpful because you can compare and offer a more robust analysis of heterogeneity across nations, across continents, across type of countries by group, for example, or by income group, or by continent in this case. Now, I will start presenting how I operationalize each of the domains that I analyze, each of the families of indicators. So I'll start by presenting how I operationalize well-being in this case, or subjective well-being index, as I call it, where basically, as I mentioned in the introduction, I treat it through two facets. The affective well-being, which is basically happiness. Basically, there is a question in WVS which asks people from a rank from 1 to 4, how happy do you feel nowadays? Very happy to not happy at all. This is basically the affective part of subjective well-being. And this is a standalone question that every survey with such data gathering asks which participants, how satisfied are you with your life from a scale 1 to 10? In this case, which is basically the evaluative well-being. And this is equally important in reality because I standardize the items. That's also important. So it have the same metric, both of them, and I create a subjective well-being index, which includes one dimension for the affective, one dimension for the evaluative, and I try to be as transparent as I am, so I don't offer a weighting in each of these dimensions. I use the mean of the standardized version, and standardization is equally important because we have a common metric across the two dimensions of happiness, and at the same time, I offer a 50-50 weight in subjective well-being, which, as I will show you later, that's also important and partially shown in the estimates in the regression analysis. For robustness now, what I have in the appendix, and I will show you shortly later on in the estimates, I have another version of subjective well-being, which lets the data weight which domain is more important per participant. I utilize the first principal component from that. So the data structure by unit offers its own weighting, but as you will find out later on, it's not distinct one measure from another. So for transparency, I utilize the standardized version with equal weighting, but if someone uses the principal component, it's equally it's equally useful, and it's a very good robustness if you think about it in this case. Radicalization or alienation, as I prefer to call it, now being in a family of researchers which were microeconometricians, we tend to appreciate even more when someone tones down their claims, because in reality, in observational data, and this is one of the main gaps, if one would say, is that in observational data, it's very difficult to spot radicalization because obviously not everyone really responds, whether they will perform a radicalized action or whether they had in the past or whether they will. This is one of the elements that I am also considering later on this analysis. And this is why, obviously, every claim any researcher will do in observational data is attitudinal at most in this case. And world value survey is very rich information, the richest survey in the world. But other than that, any claims one would make is nothing more than observational. You have to conduct, for example, a very good experiment to say whether someone is radicalized in reality. And even in the experiment itself, the failure and the bias that you have to treat and the non-response bias mostly is very high per se, which is probably why the world value survey don't really observe the same units through time, and they don't have the panel element of their survey. They have only a panel of countries, not of participants, because most people don't really respond truthfully in such questions in this case. Any case, in this work, we discuss radicalization through two dimensions. The first is the liberal attitudes, and the second is the anti-systemic attitudes in that case. So I offer the baseline measure narrow, as you will find out. This is deliberate, it's on purpose, because if I overemphasize one of the dimension, one could make a comment very soon, but why do you focus on this dimension more than the others? So I offer a narrow measurement, and I offer a vast variety of robustness exercises in order to show you which dimension of radicalization or alienation, if you prefer to call it, is equally or more important than the others. So the first is I take benefit of the rich battery of questions in WVS where they ask the trust in institutions or distrust. I called it reverse. So I create a 0-1 metric where higher values mean distrust. And when I'm saying institutions, they ask about the parliament, the MPs, the legal system, the banks, a lot of institutions. I utilize questions where discuss about perceptions about civil rights protections, about whether someone has to obey to rulers. This is a battery of questions relative to democratic liberalisms. And at the same time, from these two, I create an anti-systemic attitudes index, as I call it, which basically includes one standardized component is the institutional distrust. The second component is the democratic liberalism attitudes in this case. In more specific now, this index creates information about the ideological extremity. In specific, there is a question in WVS, which gives you a metric, how far left, from far left to far right, and the respondent has to answer whether they are, how distant they are from the middle point. In this case, there are questions regarding the role of women in the economical and political life, and those relate to gender hierarchy. I utilize questions which discuss about the in-group and the out-group trust, whether you trust others, whether you trust members of your family, whether you trust members in your neighborhood, and more. And I group them in in-group and out-group. There are questions regarding economic unfairness and how the participant displays herself within their country. For example, there are questions regarding effort versus lack, or whether someone has inherited their economic status quo or social class lately. And based on this, there is an index created, an unsystemic attitudes index. It's deliberately narrow, I repeat, in this case. And later on, as I will show you, I study each dimension separately in order to offer you a better heterogeneity analysis and presentation of how each of the facets affects and is affected by welfare and subjective well-being. Now, the most potential challenging part, and this is probably the main gap that I'm trying to fill in the literature, realized development, which is something that modern economics basically don't study so much, and there is a special need because, after all, it's not a macroeconomic quantity. So, doesn't matter, for example, if a country has a higher GDP, if its citizens doesn't realize this development. So the move from the micro to the macro element of economic growth is equally important, and one has to study how realization of economic growth and economic development uh, affects the attitudes and the beliefs of people through time. For example, there are relative studies on lived welfare, on relative deprivation and relative position, or, for example, the studies of relative income, where one of the big authors is Joseph Stiglitz and his co-authors. There are studies about the capabilities, as is the capability approach of Amartya Sen, or there are more modern studies in sociology and economics, as the one of Putnam on social capital, where they discuss about the micro dimension of economic development and how we should not rely anymore to macro quantities only, and we should go micro level and study in this case. That's what I'm doing also in this study. I'm utilizing realized development or realization of economic development at the micro level as a potential moderator, and this is important because I utilize respective questions in WVS where we discuss about relative income rank. In specific, there is a subjective very subjective question where they ask participants, where are you placed? How fair or unfair do you feel the economic system is in your country? There is a question where they are placed themselves based on their income, which income decile. There are questions where they ask participants to mention whether they are under cash income deprivation. There is, for example, a binary version where they ask, have you been without income in the last 12 months, you or your family? And I create also an additional robustness indicator where basically based on their income decile, I utilize and create a binary indicator whether the participant is below the average income decile in their own country, in this case. There are attitudes towards technology and science. There is a question where they ask participants whether science and technology makes their life healthier and better on a scale 1 to 10. There are questions that I utilize on work and duty orientation. For example, one of the questions asks, do you feel your work is a duty towards society? And another one asks them, do you believe that work should come first, even at the cost of your spare time? Those are very nice questions to discuss the labor dimensions and the feeling of duty. And finally, there is a family of questions where we discuss about disorder in their own neighborhood. They ask the frequency of robberies, alcohol consumption in streets, whether the police or the military interferes in everyday matters, about racism, about drug sales, street violence, and sexual harassment. So all these facets of economic development basically move beyond the macroeconomic element of analysis and move closer to the realized perceptions of economic growth, which can act as a potential moderator for welfare in this case. Basically, the baseline specifications are weighted linear specification, linear probability models or OLS, whereas you see here in the baseline specifications, the main outcome is the illiberal anti-systemic index here that I presented before, and the baseline association is coming in the beta. What you see in the first equation is subjective well-being, which is the core subjective well-being measure I introduced before, and this is subject to a vector of controls at the participant level, which include age, gender, urbanity, work, whether they are employed, family status, education, and many more socio-demographic characteristics. And this includes obviously time and country fixed effects to absorb any unobserved heterogeneity from the weighted associated models in this case. And for sensitivity now, and that's why I highlight the role of robustness, because as I mentioned before, without a real experiment in reality, any claim one can make are mostly prone to claims about causality. So in reality, with attitudinal data which are observational, any claim of causality is subject to interpretation. So I mostly see those are sensitivity and robustness exercises, the two-stage least square specifications that I present later on. And the real goal of this utilization of two SLS models is to show whether the baseline specification here, the linear probability model, survive after much stronger assumption as are the one in those two SLS models. Where I utilize two instrumental variables. So basically, the real goal behind the two SLS is to conduct the first stage, where basically you have to find a set of instrumental variables that are relevant to your endogenous. The endogenous is subjective well-being here, and those instrumental variables have to have an effect to the outcome, radicalization or anti-systemic index. In our case, only through subjective well-being, which is a very strong assumption, obviously, in general, and that's why proving causality is usually most challenging under this domain. Now, what I utilize is I go to the metadata of the word value survey, where there are information about the specific date and time of each interview and the month, and I create, given the time of the interview and the latitude of the place, I create a seasonal and latitude interaction interview, which is basically a timing instrument in this case, which is plausibly exogenous in most of the cases, subject obviously to specification, and I will explain very shortly what I mean subject to specification. And the second instrumental variable, which I utilize mostly for sensitivity in order to test the over-identifying restrictions under the Hansen test, is coming from an American Economic Review paper from Astraf and Galor from 2011, where basically it's an access to a coast or a river within 100 kilometers in the country per region. This is a regional variable, so I utilize the regional data in WVS, and I utilize them in the first stage, and I will show you very shortly that they are relevant subjective well-being. They can be plausibly exogenous under this setting, not strongly exogenous, but under this setting, it's controlled. It's controlled because, as you notice, I utilize time and region fixed effects, which absorb any remaining country level heterogeneity. What is distinct here in the 2SLS specification is that you cannot run, when you measure, and I measure at the country level and the regional country level, the geographic access to coast and river, you cannot utilize country fixed effects. That's why I replace them with macroeconomic indicators that characterize the country. And this is a very good switch because you can absorb any remaining unobserved heterogeneity plausibly. So any potential heterogeneity remaining in the model should be minimized, given that I also use year fixed effects to absorb any time unobserved heterogeneity in this case. And basically, this is the second robustness exercise. And later on, because I mentioned realized development in the paper, I utilize interaction terms, where basically this Vita 3, the interaction term of subjective well-being with the realized development phase set, is basically the one which informs us whether the baseline association of subjective well-being and radicalization is higher or lower given the level of realized development at the participant level. It's a partial association in this case, and it's also a sensitivity check about social desirability, or compliance, and other understandings of democracy. Last thing in the empirical strategy, there are recent studies as are the work of Timur Kuran, for example, who discusses about preference falsification, and this is one of the main challenges after all. In such studies, whether respondents are truthful when they respond the questions, in this case, because obviously, as Timur Kuran suggests in his theory, most times participants in such sensitive questions are more keen to offer an answer which is socially desirable rather than their true beliefs. So that's why I go into the survey and I find two sets of arguments and statements which look contradictory given this normal, and I call it normative inconsistencies in this case, and I utilize the same specifications as you see as in realized development. So I find the question where participants mention and suggest the importance of civil rights protection in a democracy, but at the same time, there are participants who say and they respond that we should obey the rulers, any case, whether it's an army or any other type of military or police. Secondly, there are participants who suggest that gender equality can be it's an essential element in a democracy, but when they are asked about the role of women in economic and political and social life, they believe that women shouldn't be prioritized compared to men, which is basically an inconsistency in response, and it follows the preference falsification according to Quran in this case. So this is the last part, whether the normative inconsistencies affect and moderate radicalization and the effect of well-being in this case. This is a summary statistics in my sample, which is basically it's a gross sample, and it's a vast sample of 97,000 observations across more than 150 nations over the world between 2017 and 2023, depending on when did the sampling happen per country. As you see here, I split the sample on low and high radicalization, where basically I compare everyone to their country's average, and I add them to a group. In that, in order to do a permutation test, as we call it, where basically we compare the mean differences across subsamples, and you see that subjective well-being has a difference. For example, you will see that the anti-systemic index has a vast difference in between the low and high radicalization. In this case, is almost 1 point, 0.97 difference in this case. The same happens with institutional distrust. You see that the high radicalized group has a higher level of distrust in institutions, and the same for democratic liberalism. So even from a snapshot, because this is just a snapshot, you see that based on the t-tests, there is a very big difference between the attitude groupings in this case. The same happens for every facet in specific, as you see. And what's very important is that well-being is also very different between groups, because you see that the higher than the country's average anti-systemic attitudes participants have a negative score of subjective well-being, which means lower welfare, whereas those with low, they have a much higher, and if you compare it to the mean at the pool sample of 0.01, you see significantly higher than the one, and the same happens and follows in the domains of happiness, the feeling and the life satisfaction domains, where you notice that basically the differences are closer in this case. Now, on the moderators, you notice that in the relative income rank, there are vast differences, whereas the relative income rank, for example, and subjective fragility have one of the largest in-group differences, and they are all significant, as you notice, based on a plain descriptive test in this case. And the same happens for normative inconsistencies, where you find that the higher radicalized group has a higher index of either of mean or account as created normative inconsistency, which is normal. In this case, the biggest differences are when there are inconsistencies about civic rights and whether there are inconsistencies about democracy in this case. Even from a plain income decile, you will find out that the average participant is closer to the fifth, close to the middle income decile in their country. But those with higher levels of radicalization are just lower at 4.66 compared to 4.92. So income unfairness and income ranking per se, given these summary statistics, is not really explanatory enough as we expected in this case. So we have to go beyond the baseline association and study whether there are heterogeneous relationships in this case. Now, the baseline findings basically tells us that every 1 point increase in subjective well-being would decrease anti-systemic attitudes by 7.6 percentage points at 1%. And if you notice, the feelings of happiness and life satisfaction have a much alike a close association for 5.2 percentage points to 5.1 percentage points relative to the mean. Remember, this is around 70 to 8% decrease if one does a very simplistic linearization of the effect in this case. And if you instrument the models, basically you see that the effect is turning to be higher, much higher, at 45.3 percentage points, for example, or at its lowest to 40.9 percentage points in this case, given how do you instrument it in reality. So even under stronger assumptions, we find out that subjective well-being associates negatively with anti-systemic and anti-liberal attitudes in this case. So the baseline relationship on the left panel at the columns 1 to 3 basically survives, and it's also equally significant under stronger assumptions. And this survives after the inclusion of counter-fixed effects, as you see at the bottom of the country, and the year fixed effects, and whether they are replaced with macroeconomic fixed effects, which usually absorb a part of the effect in reality. So we would expect, for example, if the relationship was not that robust, this to absorb the magnitude and the strength of the magnitude. But you see here that it remains at 1%, significant in that case. So the relationship seems to survive. If in panel B we were discussing about the dimension phases of anti-systemic index, you notice that the institutional and the institutional domain is mostly it shows the higher negative association of 16.9 percentage points, and you find out that this is a much heterogeneous set of dimensions, because you notice that, for example, that the economic element in the dimension of anti-systemic index is of 4 percentage points, but other domains are the gender, it's much lower in this case, and some even turn positive, as is the democratic or the ideological, which means that simply analyzing and running regression as I did in panel A is not informative enough. We need to go deeper and analyze which are the domains and the dimensions that matter most and make someone anti-systemic and why in this case. This is the first stage of the two-stage least squares, where you see that the relevance is basically seen given the two instrumental variables on the left panel, and on your right panel, one will see that the relevance is very strong given the F-test. To give you an idea, the average F-test that we test is 10, and this is much larger than 10, so the relevance is passing here. And as you see, the over-identifying the exogenity test is also passing, but still one has to be very careful and interpret this as robustness associations that survive stronger assumptions in the model itself. It's not really a true causality in the strict sense of causal framing in this case, in reality. Now, another element of robustness that I added is that I found alternative definitions and dimensions. So I examined, for example, what is the effect of in-group in-group alienation, where you see that the effect in the in-group alienation is much higher than the out-group. To remind you, in the out-group, as you see here, it's 1.3 percentage points here. If you go to the in-group, alienation is 3.7. It's almost 3 times larger than the out-group. And this is something that it's emphasized in the research work from Carvalho and Sachs at the Economic Journal, which suggests that the anti-systemic and alienation attitudes happen within a group of people and not because someone feels alienated against out-groups recently. And if you notice also, I do sensitivity analysis regarding the placement in the ideological scale, where you find out that there is a very large heterogeneity. For example, those who are placed far left compared to the middle point, obviously, show a negative effect, whereas one who is placed in the far right shows a positive effect to become alienated, which is also informative enough by itself, but it also opens the path for further studies to understand why such heterogeneity, for example. And when I utilize a broad attitudes aggregation, which is basically the anti-liberal and anti-systemic components in reality, where I add facets of gender, attitudes, ideological extremities, mistrust about the outgroups, and perceptions of unfairness, you see that the effect is turning somewhat larger in the magnitude at 5.9 percentage points. And the same happens when I split the subjective well-being in its domains, where you see the larger domains is in the financial satisfaction and political system satisfaction. That's mostly expected, especially for the financial. I have to point that according to Van Praag and his co-authors, which is one of the biggest studies in economics of welfare, financial satisfaction is the main facet of life satisfaction. So it's not surprising. And given the context and the relationship that we study here, the political dissatisfaction or satisfaction is also not surprising. The same effect survives and is becoming stronger when it's utilized as a composite index or under a principal component analysis that I introduced also when I discussed the operationalization of subjective well-being. So in reality, the relationship try and keep at the same level and they don't lose precision or magnitudes in reality, given a different set of robustness exercises and a different set of sensitivity tests. So even though one cannot make a causal claim of the real effect, one can say that the disciplined weighted associations here are truthful enough in order to show us a direction of relationships between those domains in this case. And so the next natural question is to ask whether the realization of economic growth relates to the formation of anti-systemic and anti-liberal attitudes, where basically what we are looking primarily are the interaction terms between subjective well-being and its facet itself. And you notice that the three items on income, unfairness, and income placement are the most important compared to the rest, because you notice, for example, that the higher effect is the subjective fragility. In this case, whether someone is without cash income in the last 12 months, where you see that it increases the probability of 1 point increase in alienation by 1.8 percentage points. And the same happens whether someone is placed below its mean income decile, which is 1.6 percentage points higher likelihood to increase alienation, the same as a relative income, because if someone is placed in a higher relative income rank, the probability of increasing alienation trends is decreased by 1.2 percentage points. And this is equally important because you notice that the rest of the phases on technology and science, work perceptions, and neighborhood disorders, while they remain positive, in reality, compared to the income perception and perception of economic unfairness, they are much lower in terms of magnitude, which means that most people basically value their own placement in the income band and their perceptions. And this is the most important part. It's not only where you are placed in your country's income band, it's how you perceive and how you compare yourself with the others. That's most important. And I call them moderators because, as you will find out, the facet itself has its own significant coefficient in this case, except for example that subjective fragility from a strictly econometric point. This is a mediation effect because it loses significance, the facet, which means that subjective well-being is mediating the role of realization of development respective to subjective fragility in this case, which is equally truthful. And these are the sets of results regarding normative inconsistencies, where basically we show that higher trends of inconsistency increases the likelihood and the probabilities of alienation, even if it's measured based on the mean index or a count version of the index. And it survives also additional robustness. For example, whether the items are all of them included equal to 3, or whether the items are lower than 1 in a count index. In this case, in the moderation analysis, we also find out that the significant effects and positive associations happen when they are in institutional type of inconsistencies. The likelihood of being more alienated is higher at 6.2 percentage points when the normative inconsistency is related to institutional matters compared to illiberal matters, where the effect is at 5% significant and only 2.4 percentage points in this case. And final thing, and I will close with that, in order to exploit even more the heterogeneity in the comparisons, I split the sample in two facets. I perform an income group analysis first, given the income decile. So you see that even for the participants themselves and their placement in the income band, you see, for example, that those who are at the lowest of the income bands, they have a lower likelihood of becoming alienated. The same for the high. Those who are in the middle, they are closer to the zero midpoint, which is also not significant in this case. So there is a vast heterogeneity in understanding why someone becomes alienated, and the same can happen whether we analyze it under a life cycle hypothesis, because, for example, we see that those who are elder and closer to 50 plus in the age group, they are less likely to become alienated, and this makes sense because the older someone gets, the higher the set of experiences they have in life and the familiarity with the political system. So it makes sense one to be less likely to become alienated and form anti-systemic attitudes. Whereas someone, for example, who is in the 16-29 age group, they are more likely to be alienated, given that they form their own perceptions and identities at times. So it's more likely to are more prone and feel more close to such rigid attitudes compared to the rest. That's why they are mostly targeted in these ages rather than the elder population of 50 plus in this case. And finally, this is a snapshot of the regional differences. All these effects come from separate linear probability models, by the way, given the region the participant resides, and this is basically a snapshot of what happens per sample or per group of countries. In this case, where you see that the lower likelihood of the lower associations are in North America and Europe and Central Asia, which admittedly are more developed than the rest of the world. Whereas in some countries, as for example in Latin America and Caribbean or East Asia and Pacific, they are closer to or even turn positive the effect of subjective well-being on anti-systemic attitudes, which basically offers a hint that there are deeper institutional and counter settings that affect such relationships. And that's why, obviously, in the baseline associations, we include fixed effects at the counter level in order to treat and absorb such relationships in this case. And this is how I close, because I probably got most of the time here to present. Sorry for the time management. The baseline finding is that higher subjective well-being is associated with lower anti-liberal and anti-systemic attitudes, which is basically an association which survives and it's robust to different settings, even at specification, for example, as in IV-based robustness check in 2 SLS models, or in other sensitivity checks in domains of happiness and subjective well-being or alternative subjective well-being measures. And the baseline finding and contribution is to present the heterogeneity in domains. In this case, because we saw, for example, that the effect is stronger for institutional distrust, for social mistrust, and for perceived economic unfairness, and it's more complex for democratic liberalism or positioning in terms of ideology in this case. And this is equally informative and it's a very good starting point for future studies. And we also saw different effects across regions, income groups, or age cohorts, and the role of normative inconsistency in this case, which is positively associated with anti-systemic attitudes. So if someone wanted to offer an overall summary, one could say that subjective well-being is not a private welfare outcome. It's linked closely to institutional and democratic orientation and confidence in such domains. And this is basically linked to political disaffection most of the times. And that's why someone has to explore, as I call it in the title itself, beyond grievance. It's not only who become grieved, it's how and why someone realizes and becomes grieved and becomes alienated. And thank you very much. And I am happy to answer any question you have.
Thank you so much, Ioannis. Yes,
Thanks.
indeed, the time a little bit got away from us, but we still have a few minutes. So if there are any questions in the audience, you're welcome to post those in chat or just raise your hand and speak up. Perhaps this will be faster, but whatever you prefer. In the meantime, while everybody is thinking, let me ask you, so your approach to radicalization is very much multidimensional. So you rely on a quite broad number of attitudinal indicators. Can you summarize just briefly, so why was this particularly important to capture all these different dimensions? Would you say a more narrow interpretation would be maybe insufficient, or?
The baseline and conceptual idea behind this is that, and if you notice, I have excluded the political component on purpose in that case because they are most correlated with any other outcome and well-being itself. So if you include everything in an omnibus index, for example, basically you risk a lot someone criticizing this and tell you that you have put your own weights in radicalization and you add your own perceptions about the importance of each dimension. So it's better to show each dimension separately and or be very careful how you claim and on what you created rather than offer an omnibus index, which is equally useful, but sometimes it's at a higher risk of being criticized on its creation in this case. I mean, for example, I find it equally important someone to understand not only why, not only if you became alienated, but why. What made you alienated? Is it because you have, for example, an outgroup alienation? Is it because you have negative perceptions about women? Is it because suddenly, for example, you lost your job and you became unemployed, so you have an economic deprivation component? Is it because you inherited or because you formed your own ideological perceptions, which are anti-systemic, or is there any other cause? So I feel it's more informative to discuss the heterogeneous dimension rather than offer you, for example, the baseline index that I showed in column 1 and present it as that.
Thank you very much. And while everybody is thinking, one more question from my side. It was very interesting to see the use of latitude in your analysis. It has been relatively not too long since the World Value Survey started documenting the geocodes. Perhaps I missed in your findings. So what was the implication of closeness, proximity to the sea or coast? Does it have any effect on well-being and radicalization?
Yes, so the baseline idea, it's a seasonal index. So I am lucky enough that WVS includes the date and time and the month. when the interview happened, and given the country, I create a latitude, seasonal latitude index, which is basically one of the correlates of satisfaction. For example, I am in Greece right now. Sun is most seen in Greece a lot. I live in the UK where sun is not so seen. So the feeling of happiness is lower given the latitude and the seasonality in this case. It's plausibly exogenous, which is equally important. So it can affect your welfare. This is the relevance, but in reality, you don't become alienated because the sun doesn't rise a lot in your country. If that was that easy, uh, it, our life would be easier. So basically, it's mostly, and if you notice, I use an interaction term. It's seasonal times latitude. So basically, we absorb any potential endogeneity from the survey itself, and we make it exogenous enough for the needs of this work, obviously.
Thank you. And does your findings show that within the same country, depending on in which part of the year the survey took place? Because you use wave 7, right, or time series?
The first one I use, and if you notice
That's
in
right.
this, yes, and I use the nuts too region fixed effects. Here I don't use country fixed effects exactly for that reason, because I want to absorb the locality effects, the
That's
locality
right.
components.
Mm-hmm. I just said that it would be curious perhaps to see in overtime analysis eventually if this has any implications on depending on when the interview took place in the same country across the years, because sometimes we survey respondents when there is more sun, sometimes when there is less sun, different seasons.
Yes, thank you. That would be
Yeah.
interesting indeed.
Yeah, so we will continue, of course, documenting the geocodes. You have demonstrated us that it's useful for analysis. So, last call. If there are any questions, please raise your hand or post the question in chat. And while everybody has the last 3 minutes to think, Ioannis, if you would be advising a group of policymakers who want to improve the life of society, whether in Greece or the UK, so based on your analysis, what would be the core recommendation?
Yes, I find it very interesting, but I find it most interesting from a moderation analysis that the perception of unfairness is important. It's not only where someone is placed, it's how they operationalize themselves, how where they are placed, and how they compare themselves to others. Most of that, for example, you notice that the effects on perception of technology or work or neighborhood deprivation is lower, and the highest of the effects comes from fragility, whether it's objective or subjective in this case. So the first, for example, column here, the 1.2 percentage points negative effect is informative itself and it's obvious. If you increase economic standing of someone, their alienation trends will decrease. But in reality, it's also mostly how we perceive fragility rather than where they are placed marginally higher, but still it's informative enough. And this is one of the facets of one of the dimensions of unfairness we don't really test in economics at all. Because even the Gini coefficient, for example, it's your distance from the mean income in your country. They don't ask how unfair you feel you are treated in terms of your economic standing in this case.
Great. Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. Yeah, so if you get any questions after the end of the webinar, I hope Ioannis doesn't mind if colleagues would contact you by email, or if you are interested in working on this topic, you are welcome to reach out. Many thanks to Ioannis for the very interesting presentation. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope to see you next time and have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you very much for the invitation, too. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Have a good day.